All right, hi Braden, Martin, and Dasan. So this is your guys' video for today. So we're talking about revolutions in this unit, and today we're going to start talking about political revolutions. So we're going to look at the Russian Revolution. All right, so I'm going to read an article to you guys. At the end of the article, I'm going to tell you what I want you to do for your assignment, the picture you need to turn in, okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so this article is also attached to Google Classroom, so if you wanted to follow along or if you had it uploaded on something else, you can. All right, so we're looking at the Russian Revolution, how the Russian Revolution changed the world. And this guy right here, Vladimir Lenin, is going to be very important. All right, 100 years ago, a peasant uprising toppled an empire with far-reaching consequences. A look at how it transformed history. All right, so we're going to start. It was a defining event of the 20th century. 100 years ago, in the fall of 1917, communists known as Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. Their ascent to power ended 1,100 years of imperial rule in the world's largest nation. Russia had long been run by despotic czars. A czar is a king. And in the early 1900s, peasants began to revolt. Russia's economy, military, and government collapsed under the pressures of World War I, 1914 to 1918. This forced Russia's final czar, Nicholas II, to give up his throne in March of 1917. That created an opening for the charismatic Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Lenin, to take power by November. Shortly after, he established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. Within decades, Soviet rulers transformed the country into a fearsome military power. One of them, the infamous Joseph Stalin, killed millions of Soviets as part of a political purge. The Soviet Union went on to engage the US in a decades-long struggle for global dominance. This conflict became known as the Cold War. Their fight was over more than territory. It was about the very survival of Western democracy. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet threat loomed over every aspect of American life. The Soviets affected everything from US politics to technology to pop culture. Their impact came to an end when their government collapsed in 1991. To try to understand the 20th century without the Russian Revolution is like one hand clapping, says Louis Siegelbaum, a Russia expert at Michigan State University. With that in mind, here's a look at 7 ways the Russian Revolution changed the world. So you can see these are the yellow countries are communist governments in 1980, and the places that have stars, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, China, and North Korea, are the only communist countries today. All right, number 1, the Cold War. Though communism ran contrary to America's values, the US and Soviet Union joined forces during World War II from 1939 to 1945 to defeat Germany. But after the war, it became clear that Moscow, or Russia, was intent on taking over vast sections of Eastern Europe and installing communist puppet regimes. What followed was the Cold War. This decades-long competition pitted capitalism and democracy, embraced by the US and its allies, against Soviet authoritarianism and communist rule. Some countries began to fall to communism, as China did in 1949. The US grew more concerned that it would cause a domino effect. This was the idea that if one country became communist, others would follow. There was also fear of infiltration by an enemy within. US officials' suspicions about foreign spies and American communists grew. This was heightened by Senator Joseph McCarthy's overheated witch hunts in the 1950s for alleged communists in the State Department and Hollywood. Movie stars and others were called before congressional committees and ordered to name colleagues who were communists. Many suspected of communist sympathies were blacklisted and lost their jobs. The idea that actors and some workers could get together and overthrow the United States government, some people took that seriously, says Andrew Straw, a Russia scholar at the University of Texas at Austin, because there was a clear example of it in 1917. All right, duck and cover. Middle school students in Brooklyn, New York, during a practice drill for a nuclear attack in 1962. So kind of like we did fire drills. All right, nuclear buildup. In 1945, the U.S. became the first country to successfully develop and use a nuclear bomb in war. But its nuclear monopoly ended abruptly in 1949. That year, the Soviet Union tested an atom bomb of its own. This began the nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the US, with each side determined to have a bigger and stronger nuclear arsenal, to have more weapons than the other. Duck and cover drills became standard in schools. Children practiced huddling under their desks in case of a Soviet attack, as if a school desk could shield someone from a nuclear bomb. Ironically, the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, kept each side from ever using their nuclear weapons against the other. Both the US and the Soviet Union feared being wiped out by the other in retaliation. Because of the nuclear buildup continued in these two countries and elsewhere. Today, 9 nations have nuclear weapons. This includes North Korea, led by rogue dictator Kim Jong-un. All right, number 3, the space race. So these pictures are from the space race. Though America was the first to develop the nuclear bomb, the Soviet Union soon celebrated its own first. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first unmanned artificial satellite. This ushered in the space age, but it also stunned and frightened the US. The next year, America followed suit with its own satellite. President Dwight D. Eisenhower also created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was dedicated to space exploration. Then, in 1961, the Soviets led the way again. They put a man into space for the first time and returned him home unharmed. In 1962, in a speech at Rice Stadium in Houston, Texas, President John F. Kennedy declared America's commitment to being the best and doing something the Soviets hadn't yet done. We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things that challenge us, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. End quote. Kennedy's promise was fulfilled in 1969. That year, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. This gave America the victory in the space race and bragging rights in the Cold War. Today, the spirit of the space race continues, with NASA preparing to send humans to Mars by the 2030s. All right, number 4, Vietnam and Korean Wars. The US and the Soviet Union never actually engaged in direct combat during the Cold War, but they fought many proxy wars. This means they contributed weapons, money, or soldiers to military efforts that aligned with their values. That was the case during the Korean War, 1950 to 53. The US fought alongside the South against communist forces in the North, supported by the Soviet Union. America lost 34,000 soldiers in the Korean War, which ended in a stalemate. It also split that country in two, Democratic South Korea and Communist North Korea. They signed an armistice, but not a peace agreement, so they technically are still at war, except this last year they signed an agreement. And North Korea remains a totalitarian communist regime with nuclear weapons that threatens the US. In Vietnam, where the Civil War broke out in the 1950s, America was also determined to prevent a communist takeover. The US began sending advisors to help the South Vietnamese. The US escalated its involvement in 1965 when it started sending combat troops into Vietnam. The war was controversial and tore the US apart. Many Americans, especially teenagers and college students, protested the war and the draft. They questioned America's presence in the faraway conflict. By the war's end in 1975, more than 2.5 million Americans had served in Vietnam and 58,000 had died. The communists won. This was a crushing blow to the US that left it cautious about future military entanglements. Vietnam remains a communist country, but like China, which also remains communist, it has embraced some free market reforms and is a vital trading partner of the US. All right, pop culture. The US and the Soviet Union continued to engage in a battle to win the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. America sought to portray itself as a symbol of freedom and prosperity. One byproduct of this was the Barbie doll, created in 1959. The doll was outfitted with dresses, swimsuits, and sunglasses. It represented a sharp contrast to the way of life in the Soviet Union. During that time, the centrally planned communist economy focused more on agriculture, defense, and housing than it did on consumer goods. In 1964, a year before U.S. combat troops were sent to Vietnam, American boys got a doll of their own. Equipped with the machine guns and bazookas, G.I. Joe grossed $16.9 million in its first year. Its popularity died out in the latter years of the Vietnam War, however, and George Orwell's 1984, a book still widely read in U.S. high schools, also grew out of the Cold War. Published in 1949, the novel expressed the British author's anxieties about the U.S. and the Soviet Union's fight for global supremacy. Orwell feared that the competition would lead to totalitarian states around the world, with Big Brother controlling our every move. Number 6, Al-Qaeda and 9/11. On Christmas Eve 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to rescue a communist-leaning government under attack by Islamic rebels. These rebels were known as the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors. To hurt its Cold War foe, the U.S. began arming the Mujahideen in the 1980s. This helped the rebels secure a stalemate against the Soviet army, which finally pulled out its troops in 1989, so 10 years later. With the Soviets gone, factions of Mujahideen battled each other. By 1996, the Taliban, a radical Islamist group, controlled the country. Among those who joined the Mujahideen was Osama bin Laden, a billionaire son from Saudi Arabia. Angered by the Soviet and American involvement in Middle East affairs, he helped found the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden would become the mastermind of the September 11, 2001 attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 Americans. This drew America into two wars, in Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. The U.S. still has roughly 11,000 troops in Afghanistan, making the war there America's longest. Today, parts of the U.S. mission there is to weaken the terrorist group ISIS. The terrorist group traces its roots to one of the radical groups that emerged in Iraq following the 2003 American invasion. Now, we've actually withdrawn a number of our troops from Afghanistan, and they did make a treaty with the Taliban, but that treaty has caused some issues with the Taliban already reneging on what they've done. All right, number 7, Putin and a new Cold War. In the end, the communist model didn't work out for the Soviet Union. It collapsed in 1991. Despite efforts by then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to loosen the economy and enact other reforms, the Russian democracy that succeeded his rule was well-meaning but incompetent. In 2000, after a decade of economic chaos, Vladimir Putin took power in a peaceful transfer of authority. Putin was a veteran of the Soviet Union's spy service, the KGB. When he came to power, he promised stability and cast himself as a Democrat. He has stayed in power ever since and has proved himself an authoritarian. During his rule, political opponents have been jailed or murdered. He has also limited free speech. And in 2014, amid political upheaval in neighboring Ukraine, Putin forcibly annexed the territory of Crimea. That was during the Olympics. More recently, U.S. intelligence officials say Putin personally sought to undermine American democracy by meddling in the 2016 presidential elections. Experts say he sought to boost Donald Trump's chances. During the Tsarist era and Soviet years, Russia was a superpower that the U.S. and the rest of the world couldn't ignore. And according to Sean Gilroy, a Russia expert at the University of Pittsburgh, Putin wants that again. His end goal, says Gilroy, is to bring Russia back to become a major global player. All right, so what I want you to do, this is a political cartoon about Vladimir Putin. So he's reheating the Cold War in 2017. What I want you to do for your assignment today, if you have a microwave, take a selfie next to your microwave. If you don't have a microwave, take a selfie next to your refrigerator. Okay, so all you need to do is take a selfie next to your microwave, or if you don't have a microwave, take a selfie next to your refrigerator to prove that you listened to the whole article, okay? All right, make sure to turn that picture in and you'll get all your points. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.